the larger considerations of whether or not the means you use, means of warfare, military means, are proportional to the objective that you're trying to achieve. I suspect that after it all settles out, that prevention and preemption, I'll work this the other way, a direct response to clear-cut military aggression, and preemption, which is somehow nearer in time or sequence to an actual attack, and prevention, which is farther away from the actual attack. Those may require, in that order, higher and higher needs for discrimination, because there may be a moral, the less that a state has engaged in warfare, the larger may be its population that is in fact innocent, in a sense that it would be discriminated out of violence if you can possibly do that. It also raises an interesting point that I've thought about of what level of cooperation with a government or a regime is sufficient to make one a combatant, which I think in this case is equivalent of saying guilty for your purposes. It's the combatant would be someone who is liable to military response, if I'm using it correctly.
Right. Just very briefly, I don't think you need to be guilty, but I think that in order to be liable, that you have to have done something wrongful. You have to be responsible for having done something wrong, which is a different, slightly different question from being guilty.
Yeah. Just to try to put it in the sort of the traditional just war context, if we factor out guilt, then we can consider whether or not, what degree you're participating in the activity that would justify military response and thus make you liable to a just military response. You know, that's an interesting point, because if you think about the case of Israel, for example, well, any country in modern warfare, in World War II, think about the case of Germany, an Allied bombing of Germany or Japan. At what point did someone become sufficiently complicit in the goals of the Japanese Empire or the Nazi regime in order to justify a military attack in this regard, in order to be liable? Is a person working in a munitions factory liable? In the more modern context, more recent context, is a family that, for whatever reason, provides assistance, lodging to a terrorist sufficiently liable by your standards in order to justify a military response? If there's a terrorist leader living in a home in a village in Afghanistan or in Gaza, wherever it happens to be, is the family, including the children, whose parents have made the decision to lodge that terrorist, liable? I don't know. These are difficult questions. They're quite difficult to resolve, but I think you've done a good job of raising those questions. I think you go on, if I understand it, to talk about the doctrine of preventive war. You talked about the national security strategy, the intent to injure, and the active preparation, and the national security strategy could in fact amount to those kinds of conspiracies. I will say that I think those kinds of doctrines, as espoused by at least the Bush administration and by previous American administrations, presume a just purpose or a just cause, that the act of preempting or the act of prevention would take place where just war criteria have generally been met. I think the criticism of that kind of preparation as a conspiracy would be that it applies to any form of military preparation, because until the military is actually used, you can't know if that use is going to be just. You often can't know it even when it is used, but you really cannot, until you come down to specific cases, understand whether the means are proportional, the purpose is correct, it's the last available result, or all the other criteria of just war. And I think that intention, by the way, is critical to just war. Let me talk just a little bit briefly about Steve's comments. I will tell you that, just as a matter of fact, just war considerations did enter into President Bush's consideration. They were discussed at cabinet level. I'm sorry Secretary Rumsfeld doesn't remember, but they were discussed at cabinet level. They were discussed at staff levels of the White House. The National Security Council staff actually went out and researched considerably into just war and tried its best, I believe, to apply it to what was going on in Iraq in 2002 and 2003. The reason I think they did that, by the way, is that John Paul II indicated considerable concern and opposition to the war in Iraq based on the lack of imminence of threat. It's precisely the kinds of considerations that you were trying to work on at CIA. And I believe President Bush was quite receptive to those for the same reasons that he was receptive to essentially natural law arguments about the issue of stem cell research. He thought about those kinds of issues. He found people who were interested in those kinds of issues to be basically in accord with his instincts, even though he himself, I'm sure, had no formal study in natural law. And so I believe those considerations did come into play. It is correct, I believe, that by summer of 2002, President Bush and Prime Minister Blair had decided that Saddam Hussein was going to go on their watch. I don't think it's correct to say that by summer of 2002, we were going to war. Now, I absolutely believe that there had been another way to get rid of Saddam Hussein and change the regime. Both would have been quite happy to do that. It would have been a far greater victory than anything they envisioned as a result of going to war. And that decision was made by the summer of 2002. That had implications, if you were in fact going to do that, for military preparations and intelligence preparations that had to take place. But I think in the President's mind and in Prime Minister Blair's mind, and I think I'm reasonably well informed on this point, the consideration was that Saddam Hussein was going to go. If that required military means, and the likelihood was that it would require military means, then he would go. With regard to the impact of sanctions, I think that's a great point that Steve raises, and it's one I'll come back to in just a minute, because it raises the question of what is an act of violence. Was the West, under UN sanction throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, engaged in an act of violence against Iraq? Well, it sure looked like it. If you measure it in terms of the consequences and the outcomes for the Iraqi people, it looked very much like that was an act of violence. And I think that raises the point that when you are thinking about just war theory in the modern contemporary time, you are really thinking about a whole range of actions of statecraft that may or may not include soldiers, may or may not include weapons, but which can have quite violent outcomes on individual persons. And the result of that is that these questions become that much more difficult when you have to factor in just war or whatever your criteria are for what is right and wrong, whether this fits a natural order of reality or whether you're violating that with any particular action. We're not making our policymakers' lives any easier with that kind of conversation, but I think unfortunately that is in fact the case. Steve indicates that from his perspective, if I understood you correctly, there was a lack of clarity on the reasons for going to war. Did I get you right?
It's not so much lack of clarity, but in how what we thought we knew and the knowns and unknowns that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld talks about as to what we actually understood about those and how you characterize them. Yeah,
there are two different points that I would make there. The first is that in my own personal opinion, with the benefit of hindsight, sitting here in 2011, in my opinion, the just war failure involved in the decision to go to Iraq did not have to do with a failure to understand whether he really had weapons of mass destruction. We believed it. The French believed it. I can assure you at the most senior levels, the Germans believed it. I do not for a minute believe that President Chirac or Chancellor Schroeder were objecting to Iraq for anything that has any reason that would come up at this conference. It was a completely different set of considerations that led them to object to this action. But I do think that the administration can be faulted and should be faulted for failing to clarify coherently and consistently what the real justification for the war was. There were several different possibilities there. One was introducing a democracy into the Middle East that would have much wider positive ramifications for a region that had a frankly terrible history of defending the human person. Second was the direct threat that was thought to be posed by Saddam Hussein by some. The intelligence did go both ways. I don't think it's correct to say that the intelligence that argued against that was ignored. I think the general gist was there is that evidence, but we have other evidence that suggests that to a reasonable person, the capabilities are what they are, and the intentions, given the opportunity, would be quite bad for us and for the region. So I think that failure to harden and identify a just purpose might be a legitimate indictment of the administration, because the first thing you have to have in just war theory is a just cause, a just purpose. But you also raise the fact that intelligence is not perfect, it's an extremely difficult business, and it really is an important consideration to understand just how hard it is to go to war based on intelligence. If you look at the record of the intelligence community over the last 2 decades, we were wrong about Saddam Hussein not once but twice on weapons of mass destruction. Wrong in 1990-91 because he was much farther along in his weapons of mass destruction than we thought. And we almost sent, we were within a few months of sending American troops, a large number, into a potentially nuclear weapon environment without even knowing about it. The reverse was the problem in 2001, 2002, 2003. We missed Pakistan and India on nuclear explosions. We misjudged Iran in the last decade in every different way that we possibly could. And so there's every reason to believe and to understand that even with the extraordinary capacity of our intelligence community, we're still going to miss it and get it wrong a lot of times. And that is an important caution for policymakers. Let me now come back just to some considerations. How close am I, Jeff, to your harsh?
Good, 5 minutes.
Okay. Just some thoughts of my own about viewing this problem. My take on both preemption and prevention, my personal view, is about what the Clinton administration's view of abortion was. I think it should be safe, legal, and rare. Professor Elshtain used the word rare, and I think that is absolutely correct for the reasons that we've just talked about because of the uncertainty. It should be safe because it should, to a reasonable observer, after a lot of consideration and debate, it should be an action that creates greater safety for individual persons rather than less safety. That's number one. It should be legal because I think it's morally and philosophically defensible and necessary. And we heard from Professor Elshtain this morning a far better presentation than I could give on why that's the case. And I think it should be rare for the reasons that Steve talks about, the uncertainties and the difficulties of knowing what the circumstances are out there when you're dealing with closed regimes who don't want you to know what they're doing and what they can do. Very difficult considerations. I do believe that governments are formed fundamentally to produce positive goods that individual persons themselves cannot produce. Now, we can talk a lot about social contract and those kinds of theories, but fundamentally that is what governments and states try to do. And that the purpose of government is to serve individual persons rather than the reverse. I believe that the character of the government that is taking military action and the character of the government that is being acted upon are in fact important moral factors, because they give you a reason to presume one way or the other and raise your threshold, or if necessary, lower your threshold about military action. I believe that authoritarian and totalitarian regimes are far more likely to do the various kinds of things that produce a just war response, justly produce a just war response, than our democracies. If we saw tomorrow, well, we'll use an extremely unlikely case now, Japan producing nuclear weapons, because it had decided that the American nuclear guarantee is insufficient and that they believe that for their security in the region, nuclear weapons are important to them, I don't think you could create a very good case for preventive action there. Iran is almost exactly the opposite case. I think you can make a very good case there. I think that Israel's destruction of the facility in Syria in 2008, which they had apparently, according to press reports, received help from North Korea on, and its destruction of the Osiris reactor in Iraq were both thoroughly just preventive actions that were safe, legal, and rare. But and again, I think the character of the government helps us identify what is legitimate and illegitimate, what is just and unjust. I do believe that one good or responsibility of government is the defense of the people it serves, and thus the need for preemption in some cases that I've already talked about. And I think that the objections to preemption and prevention are ultimately consequentialist. We talked about that a little bit now. Sometimes I think people try to argue that there is any kind of military action in the absence of a direct military provocation is an intrinsic evil. And I don't think that's the case, and I think everyone on the panel this morning, I gather we are all agreed that you have to look at consequences at some level. I may be wrong, but it sounds like that's the direction you're driving. Once you cross the line into acknowledging that consequences have an effect on whether an action is just or not, then you're in the murky world of real policy and real politics, where motives differ, where the level of confidence and the ability to predict unintended consequences will differ from case to case. And I would say finally that I'm certainly not in favor of referenda for deciding every policy issue. I don't think direct democracy is the best form of government or the wisest form of government. But I do think that there is a factor of common sense, and that over the course of time, free people, given their freedom, will make good decisions, maybe not at every instant, maybe not every decision, but over the course of time.